I think I need to sort of start with the idea of interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity or something. So my background is in sociology, cultural studies and anthropology. And I worked in a sociology department for quite a long time before finally ending up in a business school. And that's important, I think, in the sense that I'm not of the business school. I wasn't educated in a business school. And though I've been interested in organisations and organising for a long time, it was initially from a sociological or cultural studies kind of perspective, really. And the reason I think that's important is because I'm quite concerned about the way that institutions provide us with ways of seeing the world. So your location within a particular department of a particular university then provides you with a kind of perspective on the world, doesn't it? And I always think it's kind of dangerous if you forget where you stand, where you are seeing the world from. Because obviously the world as seen from a business school is often presented as a particular set of economic actors or agents with certain kinds of imperatives attached to them and certain conceptions of what the appropriate forms of organising are that you should be looking at and so on. Yeah? The reason I start off like that is because I can then explain why I end up doing quite a lot of the things that I do, which I sometimes characterise as a kind of intellectual piracy or something. So I find something which lies outside the business school and then kind of drag it back and then see if I can do something with it. So it's an activity of kind of crossing borders, of taking materials from somewhere else to where I am and trying to use them. So quite a lot of my work has been about unusual topics or organisations or themes or ideas. And that's not just me. Like a couple of years ago I wrote that thing about circuses, and that wasn't me just trying to, be funny or something. It's just I got interested in circuses as forms of organisation which are quite mobile and sort of transitive in their organising practices. And they're a form of organising, of course, the business school doesn't write about, but they then provided me with a topic to think about a whole series of things in different ways. So the stuff I was doing in queer theory was quite similar, I think. So because of my interest in cultural studies, I'm aware of the developments of queer theory in the sort of, mid-90s onwards, really, and the way in which that had provided sets of ways for people in cultural studies departments, particularly in the US, to rethink theory. And so I just decided I'd see what it did if I brought it into organisation studies to see what happened. For me, it's both a topic and a sort of a method, I suppose, a way of thinking stuff. But the other part of it, I think, is that some of the earliest work I did was influenced by what we then called postmodernism, which isn't a term I like very much anymore, but in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, lots of people were talking about postmodern organisations and postmodern organisation theory and stuff, and many of the sort of post-structuralist ideas that underpin that stuff are, of course, terribly important to the way that queer theory tries to rethink epistemology. Yeah? So, for me, it was a fairly clear progression from some of the postmodern work, particularly in terms, I think, of a certain sort of textual playfulness, the way in which queering as something that one might do to texts or understandings necessarily, I think, involves a certain kind of play, a sort of loosening of assumptions and an attempt to reconfigure them in interesting ways. Yeah. So that, I think, always would mean a certain textual playfulness as well. So, calling the piece "fucking management" was just me having fun. Yeah. And it got some really interesting reactions as well, because lots of people thought it was entirely inappropriate that I should be using these kinds of words in an academic context. It just provided me with an excuse to swear a lot. ways to answer that depending on what you think queering means. So there's one version of queer theory which is centrally about gender relations and well, you know, the kind of the heterosexual matrix and all that kind of butler type stuff. But then gender becomes a central way in which you can think about articulating standpoints from which you would be a teacher or a student or whatever else. Yeah. But there's a more general sense of queering as well. I was reading a book by Judith Halberstam, the American cultural theorist, cultural studies person, like a few weeks ago. And she now, and I think this is common in the US, uses the word queering in a much more general sense. And it kind of means something more like destabilizing or upsetting something. So I don't think that's necessarily about gender relations. I think it's about upsetting a certain form of common sense, a certain configuration of ideas or practices. But that's, you know, that's not always and necessarily about gender. It could be about lots of things, lots of other pieces of common sense. Yeah? So we could use the word in a sort of a narrow gender sense, or a more embracing. A sense of trying to break something apart or glue things back together again in an unusual configuration. Yeah? So the answer to the question about education then would depend on which version of queering you're interested in, isn't it? Because I think you could say that queer theory in its gendered sense allows us to rethink many of the assumptions about the gendered forms of teaching and research that go on within business schools, the way in which the particular conceptions of say what the formal organisation is or what the formal economy might be and so on, which are clearly highly gendered in the way that they're configured. And I can imagine ways in which that could be theoretically justified through a project of query, which is essentially a way of moving us from a binary, right, to some more complex configuration. But if you think about querying in the wider sense, then I think querying the business school would involve questioning the very idea of the business school. What's this particular form of knowledge, this institution for knowledge generation supposed to do? And what kind of knowledge is it producing, and for who, and how? Yeah? And that seems like a more generous understanding of queer theory. And when I think I'm sort of more comfortable with it. I need to be careful what I'm saying here, but I'm suspicious of arguments towards a kind of gender reductionism, if you like, in which gender becomes a sort of matrix through which we see the world. However sophisticated and difficult that might be, it seems there are so many other ways in which we can describe ourselves, understand ourselves, be understood by others. And gender is clearly one of them, and it's fundamental, and it doesn't go away, But I don't think we should assume that everything boils down to some sort of set of a kind of gendered substrate almost. Yeah. One of the ways in which say some feminists would articulate gender is kind of the fundamental antagonism or something. You know, it's the originary division. Yeah. And I don't know, that strikes me as being too essentialist. I think there are lots of divisions, lots of identities, lots of collisions between these things. Yeah. All of it. Yeah. I mean, I can only really talk with any confidence about the things that I teach. So I work within quite an unusual business school where we've got lots of people who are trying to upset their disciplines. Yeah, so people who teach strategy in some very odd ways, and people who teach organisational behaviour in some strange ways, and so on. So even though we have very often a set of courses with titles that recognise the stuff that gets taught on these things is very often quite unusual. Yeah? My own teaching is mostly organisation theory, business ethics, and bits of research methods, and some social theory, stuff like that. All of that stuff
stuff. And I'm not kind of consciously thinking about, I don't walk into a classroom thinking, I'm going to call this today, But I think it's my job to encourage the students to think differently when they walk out of the classroom. I've got a very, in some sense, a very traditional notion of teaching, I think. So, one of the references I quite often use is the dialogues, Plato's dialogues. So, when Socrates is interrogating one of his victims, then whoever it is will come to Socrates, and Socrates will say, "So tell me what you think justice is." Yeah, and the person will say something, and Socrates will then say, "So you think justice is this?" And they say, "Well, no, not like that, but something more like this." And so that's different from that. So what Socrates is doing, in a sense, is trying to use what the student has in order to rethink their assumptions. And very often, of course, the way that Plato sets the dialogues up is that whoever it is comes in and usually walks out being completely puzzled but having their mind changed about a couple of things. I mean, I've been very lucky in terms of where I've worked and the kind of support I've had at both the two major institutions I've worked at, Keele University in the 1990s and then Leicester University pretty much for the last 10 years. And they're both places that I was head of department at Keele and director of research at Leicester. They're places that I've been able to shape, in a sense, or contribute to. And one of the things I love about both of those things is that I'm not extraordinary, that people do all sorts of weird things. And my job as director of research isn't to say you shouldn't be doing that. If somebody comes to me and says, I'm thinking about doing a project on whatever it might be, I think my job is to go, great, that sounds really interesting. Yeah, that sounds, have you thought about doing it in this kind of way? Not to kind of, to shape it into a business school project, which business school people are supposed to do. And that's in part a point of sort of principle of a kind of intellectual autonomy, a certain sort of freedom, I suppose. But the other part of it is that I genuinely believe that good research starts with ideas. It starts with a particular fascination, a set of interests. And if somebody starts off with the idea that they want to become a professor or they want to get published in the American Academy of Management journals or something, then they'll produce shit work. They'll produce work which is already prefigured by the shape that they want it to be to fit into that box. So I never, for myself, start writing with the thought of a particular publication in a particular journal. I start writing because I'm interested in something, and then hopefully something unfolds and it becomes a piece of some kind, and then I worry about where I'm going to send it and who might have it. But not at the start, because otherwise, I've got a thing at the moment. I did a piece about skyscrapers a while ago, because I love skyscrapers. I find them terrible and beautiful at the same time. They're kind of awesomely frightening structures, but also staggeringly beautiful. And I've had the opportunity to go to New York and Chicago and to see some of the buildings that I've got. And I've got all these books of skyscrapers, and I saw these fantastic buildings and stuff. And so I then started to get interested. So I finished the skyscraper thing, but I now started to get interested in cranes. And I'm not sure what it is about cranes that interests me, but there's something about cranes, tower cranes, I'm thinking, that makes my heart sing a bit. When I see a crane, I get quite excited, and I want to go up to the top of the crane and see the view. And they seem to say something to me about kind of progress and movement and something. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm collecting lots of things about cranes, books and articles and comics and videos and stuff. And then I'll start writing when I've got some time. And I don't know what it's going to be. And that's really exciting, isn't it? The idea that you're assembling a set of things and then you try to shape them to see what kind of patterns seem to be within the stuff that you've got, and then hopefully produce something with a beautiful little essay on cranes. But if I knew what the essay looked like, I wouldn't be interested in doing it, I don't think. metaphors that Socrates used about himself was the idea of the gadfly. So he would kind of fly around and sting. Yeah, that's right. In order to provoke something from these, the citizens of Athens would be provoked to do some thinking on their own account. One of the problems I have, though, is that I don't like talking about what I do as if I had a particular method or aim or a program in mind. Yeah? I hate it when people tell me what they're going to do for the next... I'm director of research, and sometimes when I have conversations with academics and they say, I know what I'm going to be doing in the next 5 years, so it's this research project, it just sounds so boring. So I'm much keener on finding new things and doing something with them, rather than worrying too much about what my method is or how I might explain what I'm doing. Yeah? I think... Sorry, something just flitted across my brain then. So I was doing some work on westerns, on cowboys and westerns. And I did this presentation at a conference, and then I had a whole series of questions about, well, what does it mean? What are the implications of what you've done? And I basically brought a whole load of stuff that I thought was really interesting and was kind of showing it to people, saying, isn't this interesting? This is quite nice, isn't it? But people kept on wanting me to say, but yeah, okay, what do we do? What do you do with that? It's up to you, isn't it? If you find it interesting and useful, then take it and do something with it.
Like kittens.
That's right, yeah, like kittens, yeah. But then I had this sort of, the thing that struck me at the time, and it's a metaphor that's come back to me a bit, it's a bit like when a child collects things on a beach. So when my children were younger and, they'd be sitting on the beach somewhere, and then the kids would run back and they'd have some shells and some bit of driftwood that they'd find, or, a bit of a crab or something like that. And they'd go, look, brilliant, that's great what you've done. And I sort of want that response, I suppose, really, is that people will go, blimey, that's interesting, I'd not thought about that before, but not in a kind of, and that means we should do this now. It's like that nature thing, isn't it? Anybody who follows me is a cow. It's up to you to make the stuff. Yeah.